Good evening. Good evening. I'm Jack Klieger, President and CEO of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And let me welcome you all here tonight, and especially thank those of you who came last year to our After Charlottesville panel. We're so glad to welcome Roberta Kaplan and our co-presenters, Integrity First for America, back to the museum. We have a special night for you this evening. A little bit about the museum before we go into the program. This is the third largest Holocaust museum in the world, offering a range of rigorous and engaging exhibitions, programs, and resources, all focused on our mission to remember and to educate. A mission with enduring relevance for Jews and many other minorities who face persecution. I know that last year Robbie spoke about how this was the first time. By the way, it's a good reminder for me. Could everyone please turn off their cell phones and listening devices? Appreciate it. Okay. Clear? Thanks. I know that last year Robbie spoke about how this was the first time she discussed the Charlottesville case in a Holocaust museum and how chillingly resonant that was. So Prosecuting Hate Crimes, Charlottesville and Beyond, is a program we felt compelled to present. I know how many of us were alarmed to watch the planned and coordinated violence unfold at the Unite the Right rally, August of 2017, as unmasked and unafraid men marched on Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us." We're here now to talk about that violence, by no means an isolated incident, and the ensuing lawsuit brought by our panelists here tonight against those who planned and perpetrated that violence. We'll leave time at the end to ask questions of our distinguished guests, and we invite you to write your questions down to the note cards that were passed out. We want to welcome our live stream viewers. We also welcome who we also welcome to participate in our Q&A. We hope you'll take the opportunity to visit this institution, experience our groundbreaking exhibition, Auschwitz Not Long Ago and Not Far Away. It's worth noting that the Unite the Right ralliers explicitly said, next stop Charlottesville, Virginia, final stop Auschwitz. This is not ancient history, not for us and not for them either. We'll watch a short video about the exhibition after I briefly introduce tonight's distinguished moderator. Tonight we are honored to have John Avlon with us. John is Senior Political Analyst at CNN, appearing on New Day every morning. Previously, he was Editor-in-Chief and Managing Director of the Daily Beast between 2013 and 2018, during which time he more than doubled the site's traffic, over 1 million readers a day, while winning just 17 journalism awards. His books include Independent Nation, How Centrists Can Change American Politics. Now we're going to watch that short video about the Auschwitz exhibition, then our panelists will take the stage. It's my real pleasure to welcome them and you tonight.
Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away. Now open at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. For exhibition tickets, visit auschwitz.nyc.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm John Avlon from CNN, and we've got an extraordinary conversation for all of you tonight that I think is searingly relevant on the eve of 9/11 here in Lower Manhattan, as our country remembers that, but also recalls an old hate which is newly resurgent in the United States and around the world. Joining me tonight for this conversation is Robbie Kaplan, who is the founding partner of Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink. More importantly, perhaps, or better known, she represented Edith Windsor in the landmark case United States versus Windsor, which helped bring the freedom to marry, marriage equality, to the United States. She's also the author of Then Comes Marriage, the award, the honoree of a remarkable number of degrees, including the Columbia Law School Medal of Excellence, but she would like you to know she is perhaps most proud of her honorary degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And Ms. Spitalnick is the Executive Director of Integrity First for America, which is a non-profit, nonpartisan organization that is one of the plaintiffs in the case, I believe is the correct term. Sorry, one of the supporting the lawsuit of Sines versus Kessler that we'll be discussing at length today. She has an exhaustive list of work in politics and government and is really doing extraordinary work with her new organization and working with Robbie Kaplan. And the Reverend Seth Wispelwey is the new interim pastor at the Rincon Congregational United Church of Christ in Tucson, Arizona. He is a pastor, organizer, educator, and he was raised in Charlottesville, Virginia. And Seth was there in Charlottesville during the 2 days we'll be discussing at great length and has joined the case as well. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all watching at home as well. Before we begin, I just want to play a short clip from the Vice documentary, which was really captured the heat and the hate of what we saw in Charlottesville just over 2 years ago.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Blood and soil! 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 Whose streets? Our streets! 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 Whose streets? Our streets!
That is historically resonant hate in the heart of America on a campus designed by Thomas Jefferson in our time. And so it's all of our responsibilities. And those of you who caught the language they were saying, not simply Jews will not replace us, but blood and soil. And reading through the complaint, which I recommend you all do, it is not subtle. It is not incidental. It is not accidental. It is not occasional outbursts from a couple of bad apples in the crowd. There is a compelling case to be made that will be discussed tonight that the Nazi imagery and rhetoric that is floating around online is striking. It's unavoidable. And it's perhaps easy to forget even though it's only been 2 years. So I'd like to begin the conversation by asking Robbie, prosecuting hate crimes. What your opponents will argue is that this is an issue of free speech. You're arguing that this is something well beyond that. It's incitement, in effect. Describe to people your approach in this case.
Sure, so that's exactly right, John. The people who we've sued in this case, the almost 24 individuals and groups, including two of the people you saw on that screen, maybe more, but for sure, Matthew Heimbach and Cantwell, kind of the bald guy, are two of the defendants in our case. And when we filed the case back in October 17, their main argument, which they made on a motion to dismiss before the judge, was that, Judge, this is all about free speech. We live in the United States. There's this thing called the First Amendment, and we have a right to speak. And all we were doing in terms of during the events that you saw, during all the planning that led up to it, that they plotted and planned on a website called Discord, was just speaking. And we have an absolute right to do that under the Constitution, and you can't sue us for it. Our response to that was not even to cite incitement, but to say that that's not true because what you guys did here is engage in a criminal conspiracy. Think about it this way. If you know a bunch of people who decide that they're going to plan to rob a bank, and in robbing the bank, they'd have to talk to each other, and they do it, let's say in this case, online. Those email communications that they had with each other about who's going to carry the gun, and who's going to wear what kind of mask, and who's going to, go up to the teller first, all those communications are not protected under the First Amendment. They're speech. But what they are is speech that carries out an unlawful conspiracy. And that's exactly the argument we made here. It's exactly, frankly, what happened here. And the judge, Judge Moon, in the federal court in Charlottesville, agreed with us. So he said, this is not about the First Amendment. Another way to think about it is I said in argument, I said, Judge, if all these guys had gone to Charlottesville and they had stood peacefully on the corner holding Nazi flags and saying Jews will not replace us, as odious as I find that, obviously my name is Kaplan, my son's name is Kaplan Levine, I'm wearing a Jewish star, as odious as I find that, they have a right to do that under the First Amendment. But that's not what they did. They planned for weeks and weeks in advance, and we have their communications, how to commit violence. They talked about what weapons to use, what uniforms to wear, and I'm sure here everyone knows what Hannah Arendt said about the banality of evil. Mm-hmm. They plotted things like what products should you buy at Hobby Lobby that will best sew a swastika on your clothes. I'm not kidding you. They planned it all. They then implemented it, and Seth can speak to that. And then when they accomplished it, including injuring people like Seth and others and killing Heather Heyer, they celebrated it as a great success. That's not free speech, that's a crime. And that's what we're doing in our case. We're suing them for it, and we're going to win.
Seth, you were there on both the Thursday and the Friday. What did you see?
I saw everything Friday and Saturday. That whole summer really, and I think oftentimes what gets forgotten because August 11th and 12th was such a national trauma, really, as well as a local one. Charlottesville had been an increasing focal point for violent white supremacists and Nazis. Richard Spencer, Jason Kessler had done their first sort of neo-Klan, neo-Nazi torchlit rally in May of that year. The Klan had come again in July, all leading towards August 11th and 12th. And so part of the reason I was there present for all of it is because over the course of these weeks in the summer of 2017, people of faith and conscience in Charlottesville were increasingly articulating their desire to be a presence for love and hope and peace, but not feeling necessarily equipped for how to do that. And so me and a colleague and a multi-faith cohort with the local synagogue and Buddhists and humanists and more in the area created an entity we called Congregate so that people could feel like they could show up in the name of love and peace and specifically against white supremacy and neo-Nazism to say this is what our town wants to say that it's about. And so we had a multi-faith service right across the street from the University of Virginia on August 11th, Friday, which we had to put on lockdown. There were 2 threats to shoot up our service with an AR-15. We were trying to evacuate people out the back, and I was confronted at what was supposed to be our safe space hotel later that night trying to get some of the faith leaders there. And then Saturday morning, we tried to create a presence in the streets, singing, praying, and more, and were assaulted as the temperature in the streets rose. Before any other conflicts broke out, different groups broke through. Our multi-faith clergy line was there after the car attack, standing over Heather Heyer as medics attempted CPR. And our group, Congregate, tried to afford space for folks to be safe in what was very much not a safe environment for hours on end, which is remarkably surreal, having grown up there, kindergarten through college, and knowing those streets intimately.
So you were there with Heather Heyer in the immediate aftermath of the car attack.
Mm-hmm.
When that incident occurred, what was the atmosphere like as you tried to create space for her? Did the more violent elements, did they back off, or were they still in an atmosphere of conflict at that moment?
I was a block and a half away when James Fields drove the car into the crowd. We, other members of Congregate, sprinted down the street. So before the National Guard, before the fire department, everything, there was basically just street medics, blood and glass everywhere, bodies writhing everywhere, on mass confusion. I mean, heard pretty quickly from folks in the crowd who we knew that it was intentional, and that we weren't safe. And so what we did was quickly try to create space. We asked the medic folks what they need, and clergy linked arms. But what people don't realize is there were 19 to 30 who were grievously injured in the car attack. But then there was the ancillary vicarious trauma of so many. And so what we were able to provide, which of course then transmitted to us, I mean, it was traumatic for everyone in that space because it's one of the worst scenes you can imagine. But we're just holding people. And thanks to our Congregate network, it wasn't just about people of faith and conscience on the so-called front lines that day, but I called into our network and talked to a colleague who's an associate pastor who got on the phone, and it turns out that Rabbi Rachel Schmelkin was parked at the parking lot because we had siblings of people who had broken limbs and lacerations who were themselves in shock and falling out and didn't know where their siblings were and needed to get to the hospital. And so that's where the beauty of the fabric of, I think, what we had prepared for came into play in terms of addressing the violence that was planned. And so Rachel and her husband were able to sprint down because they were part of the support team. And so it's a weird conundrum. You know, we had technically prepared for the worst of the worst, but it wasn't supposed to be.
Nothing could
You're
prepare
not.
you for
That's
that.
exactly right. Nothing could prepare us for that. And we've been dealing with the aftermath and trauma of that ever since.
Amy, you know, the plaintiffs in this case are a series of individuals, but also groups. And I want to point out that in the complaint, in the wake of the trauma, the violence, the murder that occurred, that Seth just described, there was celebration in their communications, including one meme that said, "Back to the Fuhrer," with an H. And it, I think, really crystallizes, when you look back on this, the intentionality on the part of some people. The fact that you would celebrate a death, a murder, and to use iconography in that is beyond most of our comprehension. These individuals are being called out. Some of them participated directly in these meme sharing. Other are organizations. The law that's being used is an 1871 law passed under the administration of Ulysses S. Grant to combat the KKK in its first iteration. That is fascinating and novel. And tell me how you all are approaching the application of that law to this case.
Well, and Ravi, please jump in. But the central statute here is something called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. We're nearly at 150 years since it was first passed, and as John said, it was used during the Reconstructionist era to protect recently freed slaves from Klan vigilante violence. organized violent conspiracies, which sadly are very much like what we saw happen in Charlottesville. The internet didn't exist. Sites like Discord might not have existed to allow these individuals and groups to find one another and plan it in that way. But the same types of conspiracies, of violent conspiracies that were happening 150 years ago in the South by these Klan vigilantes are what happened in Charlottesville, the intentionality behind this. Robbie talked a bit about how specific and meticulous the planning was, that they were talking about everything from which type of bread to put on their sandwiches and whether mayo would spoil in the summer sun, to which weapons to bring, and speculating about driving over protesters with cars and potentially claiming self-defense, which is, of course, exactly what they did. So this was a very deliberate conspiracy. And the fact that they not only celebrated it after the fact, which is important to note, and you even saw in that clip one of the neo-Nazis raising up his tiki torch and yeehawing in joy as his fellow Nazis were beating up a number of our plaintiffs and others. But they don't just celebrate this, they use it as a means to inspire others to action. And what we've seen here is that Charlottesville wasn't an endpoint. It was sadly the beginning of this line of white nationalist violence that has played out over the last 2 years. Well, I'm sure we'll go into this a bit later, but for example, the Pittsburgh shooter, who killed 11 people at Tree of Life nearly a year ago, communicated on Gab with some of the Charlottesville leaders. Gab is a right-wing hate site. Communicated on Gab with some of the Charlottesville leaders before his attack. The Christchurch shooter, who killed dozens in 2 mosques in New Zealand the other month, painted onto his gun a symbol known as the hashtag that Matthew Heimbach, one of our defendants, first popularized. And so the defendants in our suit and their followers aren't just celebrating this, but they're using it as a means to create and inspire this cycle of white nationalist violence that we've sadly seen play out over and over again over the last 2 years. It also makes a case like ours that really goes after the heart of that infrastructure, after the leaders and the groups that are at the center of it, all the more important, because when we take them on and when we win in court, as we will, it has the potential to bankrupt and dismantle the leadership in a way that will have ripple effects well beyond Charlottesville.
And Robbie, one of the applications of this law wasn't only in the Reconstruction era, and I understand part of the law was thrown out by the Supreme Court, but other elements survived, but it was used effectively, particularly in the 1980s, to bankrupt the KKK at the time. And I believe their headquarters in Tuscaloosa, Alabama was seized. This is a more decentralized digital moment. But talk about the actual application of that law in that earlier iteration, and then how it could apply, how you envision it applying to the plaintiffs today.
Sure. As people in the room who are lawyers or who like or love lawyers probably know.
Raise of hands.
And you don't have to be ashamed if you don't. The civil rights amendments that were passed by the Reconstructionist Congress were passed essentially to implement the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. That was the Congress realized that the constitutional amendments were not enough, and that they needed statutes that would implement the principles and the constitutional rights that were given in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Most of those statutes, which are statutes are still in use today, apply to government conduct. So actually when I brought the Windsor case, we relied on civil rights statutes that applied to the government, that said that the government can't treat one group of citizens different than another group of citizens without having a very good reason for doing so. That's one set. There's only one statute, actually, in the civil rights kind of group that applies to private conduct. And that's the statute we're using here, the KKK Act of 1871. And ironically, the point of the KKK Act of 1871 was to implement the 13th Amendment. What's the 13th Amendment? The 13th Amendment abolished slavery.
You all see the movie Lincoln. That's about the passing of the 13th Amendment.
So the point of the KKK Act is no private group can conspire together to do something that would, as in Supreme Court language, that would recreate the badges and incidents of slavery. That's what the statute says and how it's been interpreted. So it hasn't been used that often in this country because, fortunately, it hasn't had to have been used this often in this country. So it was used, as you said, early when it was first passed in the 1870s. It was used to deal with Klan violence in the 1920s. There was an upsurge in Klan violence. It was used, tragically, for the Freedom Riders. Some of the precedents that we rely on in this case were freedom riders who went down to Mississippi and were pulled out of their cars and killed, and their parents and relatives and survivors sued under the KKK Act of 1871. It was used in the 80s. I have to tell you, as someone growing up when I did, I'll betray my age, I was born in 1966 in Cleveland, Ohio. It never would have occurred to me in a million years that we would have to use the KKK Act today, again, the way we have to use it now. And really, the only thing that's changed about it, as you pointed out, John, is not the statute. It's not what these people were doing. It's just that because of the internet, because of technology, which, to quote from the Torah, is in a lot of ways both a blessing and a curse, because of technology, they were able to do it on so much more of a massive scale. So these people who kind of have lived isolated from each other for so many years are now able to talk to each other, are now able to organize and plan with each other. And although some of the people in Charlottesville, Jason Kessler was a local, most of the guys who came from all over the country and descended upon Charlottesville, having planned it for weeks in advance. And so the district court in our case agreed that was a classic KKK Act conspiracy. I'm quite confident the circuit court will, and if it gets there, I'm quite confident the Supreme Court will as well.
And some, there were KKK offshoots involved in the rally, neo-Nazi groups. I mean, it really is a motley crew of hate groups and individuals. Seth, you're a native of Charlottesville. Charlottesville has had a reputation in recent decades for being a very tolerant, inclusive place. And as a local and as a reverend, how do you understand some of these homegrown hatreds that really were brought to bear, that some of these folks were students? Did it blindside you as a native of Charlottesville, or had you seen something like this brewing on the margins?
That's a really good question. And I'm also an alum of the University of Virginia, as Richard Spencer and Jason Kessler were. So that does, I think, draw into sharp focus who we are, not just as a community in Charlottesville, but as a country.
Yeah.
It's worth mentioning, among the motley group of neo-Nazi groups, KKK, and others, there was a multitude of Make America Great Again hats and flags amidst the swastikas and stars and bars. And I think if anyone's followed the news, they'll know there is zero light between the White House and those who came to Charlottesville and the man in El Paso the other day. I think Charlottesville, as a reputation, I think the city of Charlottesville went 90% for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election, which I think is worth mentioning because Charlottesville became a ripe location, but also during a ripe time. That's why I brought up the MAGA hats. There was an emboldening. There were kind of flowery journalistic pieces about some of the people who ended up coming to Charlottesville for the Unite the Right rally in the year or two beforehand. What catalyzed Charlottesville, I think it was because we like to think of ourselves as inclusive and welcoming, that also made us kind of prone to not necessarily recognize the threat that was right under our noses. You mentioned that the University of Virginia was founded by Thomas Jefferson, and that's where they rallied with the torches. Jefferson obviously had a lot of wonderful ideas and ensconced them into our nation's founding fabrics about freedom and equality and lived by almost none of them. I mean, he's our country's godfather of white supremacy in a lot of ways. So that's number one, the election of 2016. And then the city of Charlottesville had voted, and this is what led to the so-called Summer of Hate, to remove, the city council had voted to remove our Confederate statues from our most prominent public parks, our statues that are essentially Jim Crow era Civil War participation trophies, monuments to white supremacy. And it's very telling and interesting that that's all it took for this so-called "you will not replace us." It gets at a larger, I think, malaise in the country that a bunch of men who look like me. You mentioned, I'm a reverend. It's almost there, but for the grace of God go I. This country is designed for men who look like me. And there's a lot of men trying to reassert that primacy and feeling very emboldened to do it in the name of violent hate that has to be cauterized and addressed.
I think it's worth noting that this was being billed as a Unite the Right event, and for a long time we had heard that the alt-right was not fundamentally bigoted. Richard Spencer is there sort of at the coining, and he is an exemplar and someone who's being called out in this document as someone who has fomented hate quite specifically. And I think we want to be careful about not saying that we're talking about every supporter or voter for Donald Trump in the plaintiff's this case. I think that's an important distinction to make. But the point you're making is about an emboldening that you've seen, and that stuff that maybe had been submerged before seems louder and more present. And certainly that's clear in these communications. So, Amy, as you look at these groups and their resurgence in recent years, how do you understand the perhaps brief political prominence and something bordering on fringe legitimacy that some of these figures have had?
Yep. I think there are two main factors that have gone into this, and we've alluded to both of them. Robbie and Seth and I have probably over the last few minutes. The first is the role of the internet, in that they had never been able to find one another in the same way. You used to have clan dens, and that's where you would go and put on your white hoods and meet your fellow clansmen and do your awful things. And that was the communities in which they operated, but they were disparate, they were limited to your regional area. Now you have sites like Gab, like Discord, like 4chan and 8chan, so many others. Telegram is the latest one, and we can talk a bit about that later, where they're just so able to find one another and propagate this hate and then take it out into the real world. And I talked a bit about the cycle of violence before, in which they're using each attack to inspire the next, and that is being done through these sites. And so people who might have been relegated to sort of their corners of the world, to Richard Spencer giving his campus talks, all of a sudden is now having it promoted on these sites, and it creates a momentum for it in a certain way. And the other is what Seth just alluded to, which is that at this particular moment in our political history, they are especially emboldened. One of our defendants was talking about how Charlottesville was really just another Trump rally, and they were going to go down to DC for a Trump rally this summer, and they really feel an ownership around this president's election in a way that I think is stunning, that they feel they got him elected, and that the central role he plays here is really important to acknowledge, mainly because it speaks to how emboldened they feel right now. White hoods are a thing of the past. These people are happy to go out there with their names, with their faces, and spew their awful hate and then commit violence like they did in Charlottesville because they feel so emboldened right now. And the same thing goes for the threats that we get. When we get a threat about dead Jews and Zionists, which we get quite frequently, sadly, it is being sent from people's real email addresses who say, I'm a former Marine and I'm thrilled to see Jews being murdered in their synagogues. And real people using their real names. And so that level of emboldenedness is, I spend all day, every day talking about neo-Nazis and white supremacy, and I'm still shocked by it every time I see it.
You showed me the email you just referenced, and that came to you just a few days ago. And Robbie, I know you've gotten some recent threats on Telegram.
I get a lot of love letters.
Yeah, it's the cost of doing business these days, it seems, in journalism and law, and certainly what you're doing. But it really did strike me that in this complaint, people are sending hate mail with their return address. And it's as vicious and violent, and it's sometimes political. It's extraordinary to see, and it's hard not to say that these folks do feel that, folks in the White House, it is wrong to associate them directly with these individuals, but these individuals seemed emboldened in some way. They feel they have permission.
So there are two things about this that I find quite extraordinary. I'm actually curious to hear what Seth thinks about this. I don't think we've ever discussed it before. But so we were here a year ago, as you heard Jack talk about. I was here with my co-counsel, Karen Dunn. And to be honest, I think people thought maybe we were a little bit hysterical. We were talking about this case. We were talking about the facts. We kept saying what a huge problem this was. But I think some people probably thought what an old partner of mine used to say, that, Robbie, you always think the sky's falling down, and that we were kind of exaggerating how bad this was. This is a situation which I really wish I had been wrong, quite frankly. I really wish everything I predicted would happen a year ago was completely incorrect. Sadly, it hasn't been. What we've seen in Pittsburgh, in El Paso, over and over again, is the ramifications of what started in Charlottesville, and the emboldenment not only of hatred, but of committing violence based on hatred. The other thing, and this is what I mentioned, I'm curious to hear what Seth thinks, that I have found extraordinary about this, is that while these guys, and it's mostly men, although we've deposed a woman or two, so there are women involved as well, while these guys hate African Americans, and they hate immigrants, and they hate gay people. I fit in a lot of these categories. They're not crazy about New Yorkers. The one group that they hate with a passion that overrides all their other passions are the Jews. There is no question about that. When you read that, which I wouldn't recommend to anyone to do, but when you read their messages and their emails and their chats, the people they talk about the most are the Jews, sending us back to Auschwitz, putting us back in ovens. Jews will not replace us. Most of these people don't know a lot of Jews, I don't think, in their day-to-day lives. But there is no question that that is what motivates them. And again, you've seen that. You've seen that with the deliberate targeting of Jewish places of worship, of synagogues, of institutions like this great museum. I have found it astounding. I think I'm a pretty cynical person because I'm a litigator and I live in New York and I practice law, and I thought I was pretty thick-skinned. But even I have been shocked by how this anti-Semitism motivates so much of what they do.
Amy, what's surprised you so far in the case?
That, and the flagrancy of it. I think, there's so much to talk about here. I think what has been also interesting to me is the ways in which the case has really served as both a deterrent for many of the defendants. So Richard Spencer, for example, has talked about how he can't do his usual stuff because he's being sued, and that's great. That's a win in and of itself, and that alone makes me pretty proud to support this case. But then there are a handful of other defendants, like Chris Cantwell, who we saw in that video earlier, who used this as an opportunity to further rile up his loyal followers to action. And so a couple months ago, Cantwell issued a pretty vile anti-Semitic threat against Robbie. It used anti-Semitic language I would never repeat anywhere, let alone here. And we filed a motion in the case seeking to enjoin Cantwell. It had a great affidavit from the ADL talking about how threats like these aren't just about the defendant's own capacity for violence, but how they use these things to motivate their followers to violence. And it's on the IFA website if anyone's interested in reading it. But I think it's surprising, again, and this goes back to this question of emboldenedness, that even now, they're still, 2 years after being sued, this guy is out there threatening the lawyer that is bringing this case because he feels like he can get away with it. And we're not letting him get away with it. We filed those papers within weeks of the threat. I mean, within a week maybe of the threat, days of the threat. But again, there's a level of emboldenedness that continues to amaze me.
One of the things that's interesting and striking to me is the thin edge of the wedge of a lot of this. That some of the language that the complaint indicates that you will not replace us as a slogan, that language of replacement has echoed far beyond its inception. It has echoed in shooters' manifestos, yeah, it's true, but also on cable news broadcasts whose folks are presumably not aware of the roots of what they're echoing. I believe it's important to be give that benefit of the doubt. But another striking thing in the complaint, and Seth, I'll bring this to you, is Kessler saying, quote, "The Confederate flag is the best optics because it's beloved by legions of Southerners who are on the doorstep of becoming just like us if we can move them beyond heritage, not hate." And the reason that struck me so much is they see these folks as being allies. The folks who are saying heritage, not hate, presumably do not in any conscious way. But they're being seen by these professionals as a mark, and that they can win them over. And so as a Southerner, and as a reverend, how do you balance the empathy you have to feel for people you disagree with an understanding that some of these folks are being duped and used, who may not understand the extent to which they're being duped and used by neo-Nazis?
It's a good question, and it gets at the importance of symbols and how we congregate and where we rally around. I think it's a good context. So what you're talking about with the idea of like the people are big on the stars and bars and like to proclaim heritage, not hate around that symbol. What Kessler and others are trying to do and recruit is their primary goal is a white ethno-state, and it gets at this replacement theory, which is really just a precursor to genocidal language that says, you know, we're being bred out or this sort of thing. And there's a lot of intersecting movements in there from incels and others. So that's what they mean. The goal is for a white ethno-state. And Robbie was 100% right. On the front lines while we were singing and praying before the physical attacks started from the white supremacists, the most virulent and vocal slurs that were hurled at our line of people of faith and conscience, which is really anyone who is out there confronting them, were anti-Semitic and homophobic. You know, we oftentimes think of the Muslim ban and the people being against Black Lives Matter, that too, but when it got most visceral and personal, and our line was queer rabbinical students and Muslim women and Black civil rights leaders and stay-at-home parents and lesbian clergy and a few folks who looked like me, which was a disappointment. We wanted a visual, and this gets at your question, of a lot of white men visibly saying, you know what, God, whatever spirit you subscribe to, that's a higher power with us, weaving us all together and reminding us of the truth that we belong to one another, is not okay with this hate. And that's where I have grace and space for those who we might otherwise call evil or perpetrators of hate and violence. Having been accused of inciting it myself simply for showing up, my response is to say, what if we shift our perspective to those who the white supremacists hate the most, which is everyone I just named, that beautiful fabric of humanity that was most at risk, saying we need to assert that humanity here. What if we shift our perspective to those who are angry and scared and hurt and confused because their humanity's on the line now, existentially? So I'm talking to my fellow cis, hetero, white, Protestant people who hold so much power. Then
they don't feel powerful, though. I think that's one of the ironies of here. These folks feel like they're under threat. They feel like they're lashing out defensively, which is one of the stunning psychological leaps.
And that's because I think white supremacy, and you could say patriarchy, and these other dominant spiritualities that inform our nation's identity are a lie. They're a lie that take us away from the truth that we belong to one another. And so if all it takes is removing a Confederate statue to say, you will not replace us, that's where I have grace and space to say, those yelling this vitriol and doing violence are doubling down on that lie, and in a sense maybe being more honest than a lot of us around what our roots are as a country. But by showing up, by confronting them, by creating consequences for that violence and language, you say, nope, if there is a God, if there is a higher power, if it's true that we belong to one another, and if it's true that we're all created with certain inalienable rights, then we're going to show up and assert that. And in so doing, if we do so in love and with truth, you start to hopefully plant seeds that demonstrate, God loves all these people over here. And that was our goal with Congregate. But also life's really short, and so we had to make our call and stand with the folks that white supremacy seeks to crush underfoot. We're living in a pretty tenuous time with the demonization of immigrants and Jewish communities and more, and it's having a real violent impact. There's no both sidesism to that.
Well, and I think an important point to note is the ways in which this is all interrelated, right? Like anti-Semitism is really at the core of this replacement theory ideology, but for example, the Pittsburgh shooter cited the synagogue's work with HIAS, with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and its work with refugees, because the threat that they feel, the fear that these white supremacists and nationalists feel, is that they are going to be replaced, as we've been talking about. And so the Jews in their minds are really the entity that is making that happen. And that is why anti-Semitism is so central to that ideology, and in the ways in which if we need to be approaching this from this interconnected place, that we can't lose sight of the ways in which the hate they feel against Jews is connected to the hate they feel against immigrants and Muslims and LGBTQ community.
That's right. Robbie, I see you've got a copy of Barry Weiss's new book.
So I highly recommend Barry Weiss's new book, which I just got from Amazon today. And in it, she's a friend and a really great person in the struggle. And she writes the following about Jews will not replace us. She says, "At first I heard the line as maybe you did. We won't allow Jews to take our place in college, in the corner office, wherever. It seemed straightforward. But I wasn't thinking enough like an anti-Semite. Behind the slogan, Jews will not replace us, is the ancient anti-Semitic notion of the Jew as the evil puppeteer, the devil behind the curtain pulling the strings. In this case, they are pulling them on behalf of black and brown people. How? By controlling progressive politicians, by organizing caravans of illegal immigrants to storm the southern border, and so on. The logic goes like this. Whites are at the top, blacks and browns and immigrants are at the bottom, and Jews occupy the duplicitous middle ground. They can and often do appear to be white, but they are in fact slavishly loyal to those at the bottom. Thus, the Jews are the ultimate betrayers of the white race, the most powerful racial enemy white people have." Barry says it much better than I could, I think, what was really going on and what you heard those guys saying on the video and why they were saying it.
So you think that's the virus of anti-Semitism at the heart of this, despite the fact that a lot of that's been submerged in our more vocal political debates, that anti-Semitism may be at the root of a lot of this. Because I think that, one of the things about Charlottesville is we had to confront neo-Nazis. We've understood the KKK on American soil, and some of the language in the complaint is striking, where they talk about Alabama wind chimes as slang for people who've been lynched. But that here, there's the language of the Nazis in the United States. And that's something a bit new. That's something extraordinarily dangerous. And it seems to be part of a global trend, the distance between Christ Church and the Tree of Life Synagogue and El Paso, that I think we need to confront in a very clear-eyed way. I want to give each of you a chance to sum up your thoughts, and I want to get questions from all of you, and we're going to have them delivered up in note cards, which I believe have been passed through the audience. Seth, how has Charlottesville tested your faith?
So in a funny way, I've been a faith-based professional my entire career, which spans now, 16 years, mainly working with communities of faith on public policy issues related to hunger and AIDS and forced labor. And I went to seminary somewhere in the middle of that, but my ordination came just because I never had time to finish the last paper or something at the beginning of 2017. And so I had built this broad, ecumenical, multi-faith network. I would often joke, I'm not a good grassroots organizer, I just make it my business to know everybody. And a fluency and a lot of traditions, and believing that we are stronger all together, we belong to one another, by our power and voices raised, we can change laws on Capitol Hill, or this, that, and the other. And so being from Charlottesville, in 2017 with a fresh ordination felt like a perfect storm. I never experienced a clearer call in my life, though I also wish 15 hours a day hadn't been consumed by Nazis that summer. To say, like, if anything matters, shining a light in this moment matters. I don't think we had a sense of how big it would get, or that this would be the beautiful and bold story to keep telling even in spite of the threats. So my final thought is, my faith has been tested, though, and I've alluded to this, which is that a lot of faith leaders in Charlottesville who I knew, called friends, who were pastors before me, elected not to be leaders in that moment. And I think that's both an encouragement, but also a stark challenge for where we are currently, for folks to say, a lot of folks say, I would have marched in the 1960s, or I would have done this or that. It was simply because I found myself in close relationship with my Jewish siblings, people of color, queer folks in Charlottesville, that my perspective shifted. But my faith has been tested by seeing a lot of white Christian male leaders who would quote Martin Luther King Jr. 51 other weeks out of the year, when the time came, and the time is always now. Sounded like the 8 Alabama clergymen, which was a multi-faith cohort that King was responding to in a Birmingham jail. And so it's kind of God's sense of humor that I am a professional faith leader, because we felt so alone out in the streets. But I think that's also where the living God meets us, and our lives were very much on the line. I'm grateful to be here today, but it's been 2 hard years so far, and now counting, of trying to integrate a whole new perspective on what does it mean to be a pastor in America today, because once we crossed through that fire, there was no going back. And so I hope for more solidarity, and it's been a gift to have it. And not feel like we were going crazy for what we experienced and what was really costing us by having Robbie and Amy and the whole team that each bring come alongside us. And that's a part of why I'm very much a part of this, because it's cost, but it's also a story worth pushing forward.
Amy, in the past, when America's had an outbreak of hate and violence that explodes onto our consciousness, it has often, but not always, served as a mirror from which America recoils. The air gets let out of that particular balloon. This seems different. So as someone who's involved in political movements, how do you understand the fact that there still seems to be energy behind this political movement? Not these individuals necessarily, but a broader energy, a lack of a full-throated denouncement, a sense that this is still being litigated in debates we're having in our civic space.
Well, I think sadly in many ways, Charlottesville really was that beginning, that precursor, as opposed to that moment that opened people's eyes in the ways that it needed to. In retrospect, it's a flashpoint. We see how it really led to so many of these other incidents, that the emboldenedness of these defendants and their supporters, the ways in which the internet has played a role here. We saw that all happen in Charlottesville, but at the time, no one really recognized that this was the beginning and not the end of something, and that because of many of the reasons you listed. And for me, I think it's going to take a much larger groundswell along the lines of what Seth is talking about. It's going to take people who are not comfortable talking about white supremacy. It's going to take people who look like us on the stage and who look like people who were marching in the streets of Charlottesville coming out, as opposed to the victims of this hate coming out. And I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And even a couple of years ago, if you had asked me what I'd be doing with my life, if I'd be spending my days thinking about Nazis and raising money to sue them and working with these brave, amazing people, I would have said, you're crazy. But in the last, I would say, 3 years, the political dynamics have shifted such that this is where we're at, that the reality of our world right now is that this is where the major fight is, and we are at the very beginning of that fight instead of it. And it's going to take, I think using the courts is a very important piece of that strategy, but we're not going to be able to do it alone. We, of course, would love all of your support in doing it. But I want to make clear that this is not going to be a silver bullet. This is going to be one of many important steps that need to happen in our political system, in communities of faith. And actually, IFA just launched a clergy toolkit that's on our website that gives communities of faith the tools to talk about this issue. It's going to take work in academic institutions where so many of these people, like Richard Spencer, have been welcomed with open arms. And it's going to take a real multifaceted approach to breaking down this movement that has been allowed to develop. It might be a disparate movement. It might be one that's held together by these online forums in ways that perhaps previous movements haven't. But it's a real movement, and there are real people who are leading it. We're going after them in court, but it's going to take a wider effort across government, across academia, across faith communities, across our political system to break it down. And I'm confident that there are people who are willing to do that work, but we need to get there soon.
Robbie, to you before we get to the questions, you have faced bigotry and hate in courtrooms for a long time and rather successfully. What keeps you having faith and confronting the mob impulse when it erupts with the law? How do you feel confident as you face this case?
So I remember as a kid, the way many of us were, I think, as kids, getting a lot of Holocaust education when I was young, and reading kind of obsessively about the Holocaust, and then going to bed at night and sitting, kind of lying in my bed and thinking to myself, what would I have done? Would I have had the courage to know the threat? Would I have had the courage to fight back? Could I have been Hannah Senesh? I remember literally thinking those thoughts as a young kid. I'm by no means saying any of us are anywhere near Hannah Senesh. Thank God we're not. But I do believe that the current days call us to question of who we really are. And speaking as a Jew, which informs so much of what I do every day, who we are as Jews and what it means to be Jewish and what it means to fight back. We fight back in this case not by brandishing tiki torches or automatic guns or any of the other horrific weapons used by the defendants. We have the ability in this country, in a way that the German Jews did not, frankly, to fight back in court. And if you look at American history the way you were talking, every couple of decades or so in American history, there is a trial that has an impact far beyond the parties to the case. So obviously the Scopes Monkey trial is very famous for that. In my generation, the Prop 8 trial done by David Boies that was happening while my case was winding its way through the courts woke up the American public to the reality in Prop 8 that gay people in their relationships were no different than anyone else and had the same right to be treated with equal dignity. I believe that the trial in this case, and I promise you there will be a trial. There was no settlement with these people. The trial of this case will have that same impact. And while we very, very much want to get compensation and injunctions and relief for our clients like Seth, we also want to send a very strong message, and we want to wake people up. The way that the shofar that we all, or many of us, are about to hear in synagogue is meant to wake people up. I hope and very much pray that the trial in this case will have that same wake up. And that's one of the many things that needs to happen.
So, thank you very much, all of you. So we're going to get some of your questions from the audience and from folks watching the live stream. And Robbie, your last comments there, I think, began to address this, but from a live stream viewer, can you update us on the status of the case and what you hope the lawsuit will accomplish specifically?
Yeah, so let me just start with the status. I'll be frank with everyone, it's slow going. These guys, you're not going to be shocked to learn, are people who don't have a lot of respect for the law and the courts. We have heard virtually every excuse possible to why their phones don't work anymore, and they don't have emails or texts to produce to us from, I had a big fight, Matthew Heimbach had a big fight with my ex-wife, and she trashed my phone, to just by happenstance my phone fell in the toilet, to pretty much every version of that. We have fought back very hard. We basically said to the court, we will pay ourselves to get these devices, these laptops and phones, and have an independent forensic technological firm extract the data, which they've done at enormous expense, hundreds of thousands of dollars to get it done. And we still don't have it, but we will have it soon, I promise you. Michael Block is here with me, my colleague, and his job 24 hours a day is to make sure that we have it soon. We will. Trial is likely, if I were betting right now, trial is likely to happen in the summer or maybe the fall of next year. So the country will be in the midst of a big election, probably when the trial is happening. What do we want to achieve? We want to win. I'm confident that we will. We want to get as much money as we can. These are not rich people, but we want to get their money, and we want to know who financed them. They had a lot of money when they went to Charlottesville. They had all rented these white vans that they kind of used to move people from place to place. They had uniforms. You saw it. We want to know who paid for that, and we want to go after those people as well.
And would you think that's the kind of detail that will come up in discovery? Do you have indications that it was actually large donors or grassroots?
So not yet, but in my spare time, I litigate cases for Wall Street for 30 years now. I know how to follow the money. That's what I do for a living. And we will follow the money here to figure out where it came from and who the sources are. And then again, I think it's so important, what I said before, to have a trial that is really a show trial, but not in the Stalinist way, in the best of ways, and as an educational moment for this country to learn what really happened, what we really face, and how we all have to fight back against it.
If I may, we should come up with a different term than show trial.
Well,
Can I add two quick things to Robbie's point? So I think one, Robbie's being modest, but it has been slow, but also our legal team has really ensured that we are not just getting what we need, and they are fighting tooth and nail to get that. But we've had significant victories. Just the other week, there was a major court win in which the court sanctioned 3 key defendants, 2 individuals and 1 hate group. And this is the first time there's been significant monetary penalties against some of the defendants. And that was a huge victory and really speaks to how victims of white nationalist terror, like our plaintiffs, are able to go to court and start seeing real recourse like that. And that speaks to the second point that I want to make, which is that something I alluded to earlier, that this case is about Charlottesville. It's about justice for people like Seth and his fellow plaintiffs and holding these people accountable for the violence they wrought there that we saw earlier. But these guys are really at the center of this broader movement, and the ways in which they inspire and promote hate that has happened across the country and around the globe will have ripple effects well beyond Charlottesville. And by going after the individuals and groups that are at the center of this movement, potentially bankrupting them and dismantling their infrastructure, this will have major repercussions in the broader fight against white nationalist violence. And that is something else that, when we win at trial, will be a huge, important step forward in the fight that we've been talking about.
Yeah, so we don't have the ability, prosecuting is maybe a misnomer because none of us have criminal authority. I can't put any of these guys in jail the way James Fields is now going to spend the rest of his life in jail for this. But we will get very large judgments, and then we will follow these people around for the rest of their lives with those judgments, and we will garnish their wages, and we will put liens on their homes, and we will make it very, very clear to them and to anyone who seeks to try to ever do this again that it will not be easy, and they will not be able to continue to have money and assets to kind of commit this kind of violence going forward.
And we've already seen the deterrent effect, where defendants like Spencer have said, well, I can't go back to business as usual because I'm being sued, which is important.
This is an interesting question, and whichever you want to take it. As far as you know, has there been any initiative to talk with any members of the Trump administration or members of Congress to overcome the explosion of these groups with so many supporters sometimes in their name?
It's really a question for you. To quote my mentor, Paul Weiss, I'm just a poor country lawyer who's litigating this case, but Amy should really answer that broader question.
Look, I think there's a much broader...
It's a bigger question, I think, about
exactly.
building coalitions.
Yeah, and Seth should answer
and what's
too.
the posture of the Justice Department, et cetera.
Look, I think there's a lot that could be said about what the federal government can do and might not be doing right now. I'll just say a few things on that front. One, there are some individual cases brought against people like James Fields, and James Fields, who drove the car, is going to jail for life, and that is important. But there hasn't been a larger case brought by the Justice Department against the broader coalition of individuals and groups responsible. This is really the only case that's at this stage that's doing that at this point. There's a lot of theories from people who are far better versed in federal authority than me about what could be done there, but we believe something could be done there. I will also say that's important because at the same time that things like Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and Poway and El Paso are happening, the federal government has actively been dismantling a lot of the infrastructure meant to deal with this, which is, I don't even know the words to describe that, frankly, but the Department of Homeland...
Extrapolate on that.
Yeah, the Department of Justice, their Civil Rights Division was created for the purpose of defending people's civil rights, defending people like the victims in Charlottesville. And instead, DOJ civil rights investigations are down 60% over the last few years. The Department of Homeland Security had a domestic terror intelligence unit that was meant to track and identify people like the terrorists we've seen over the last 2 years. And that unit was cut. Now, I will say over the last month, especially since El Paso, there has been some positive signs from the FBI and other federal agencies. But I think, when you look at the stats that I just listed, when you look at what happened in Charlottesville and how it really previewed so many of the other awful attacks in recent years, it's hard to feel like there might be a partner there right now. And so it makes this case all the more important.
And should say, too, FBI Director Christopher Wray has said there's been a dramatic
Correct.
increase in arrests and cases involving white supremacy.
And there are very good people in the federal government fighting for this. But I think the leadership at the top has made clear that this was not a priority. And of course, we've talked about the ways in which they've emboldened these individuals.
There are two streams I want to follow here. One has to do with the legal hurdles that make you focus on the civil judgment. But first, I've got a question for Seth, which is, how do you believe the rhetoric of the president's very fine people on both sides further emboldened groups? And do you believe this is perhaps a wake-up call for those who perhaps don't fathom how dangerous the situation is?
I sure hope it's a wake-up call, especially for fellow white and white-identifying folks. I'll mention this, and it's a good segue from what we were just discussing. The group, which is a defendant in the case that it specifically assaulted a group of clergy and faithful folks, Identity Europa, they've rebranded themselves as some other nonsense, but they have a reading list, and this was revealed or posted online just in the past month or two. At the top of their reading list, if you want to be a member of this group, are the books of Tucker Carlson and Ann Coulter and others. So these are household names that are watched by millions of people who are promoting and promulgating the same replacement theory stuff almost verbatim as we heard in Charlottesville. So I think I would invert the question a little bit into an answer to say, like, if the current administration, like we talked about the MAGA hats and the flags and so on in Charlottesville, they know they're being spoken to in coded and oftentimes explicit language. So if the current federal government and administration doesn't want that to be the case, maybe they should ask what they're retweeting and saying, and the revolving door of talking points between Fox News and themselves that allows all the people we're suing to think like, that's my guy in the White House. You know, like they have to show that they're on the side of our ostensible national ideals of liberty and equality for all. But right now, as we've seen from Charlottesville to El Paso, and just the proliferation of hate crimes, I don't remember the exact percentage spike since late 2016, cause and effect is looking more and more likely.
So, Rob, this next question is for you. One, as far as you know, where's the FBI in tracking these individual groups? Had they been on the FBI's radar? And then a really interesting and important question about do new laws have to be passed to prosecute neo-Nazis as domestic terrorists? Because there are specific hurdles people might not appreciate with labeling domestic groups that might be called domestic terror groups as terror organizations.
Yeah, so I'm glad. In terms of the FBI, I honestly don't know. They don't share that information with me or with us. As Amy said, I do have the sense that they are focused on it now, or more focused on it than they've been. They've seen what's happened. And certainly when we have asked for their cooperation in security, they have been helpful on that. And that's a good thing, because we have very serious security concerns for Amy, and Seth does, and the lawyers on the case. In terms of the terrorism bill, I mean, this is a hot political issue. The issue, just so everyone understands, is if you come into the United States from a Muslim country and believe in radical Islam and brandish a gun and kill someone or commit violence in any way, you can be labeled a terrorist, and there are very strict federal terrorist laws that apply to you, and they're very powerful, and you can be sent away for a very long time. And the government can really go into your network and prosecute a whole bunch of people. If you are a terrorist who grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and do the same thing, but it's based on neo-Nazism, white supremacy, and ideologies like that, under current federal law, you cannot be prosecuted as a terrorist. And there's obviously a gap there.
And the reasons for that, explain to folks the theoretical reasons for that.
The historical reasons are really, a lot of them are First Amendment reasons, of a concern going back in American history that the government would prosecute communists, radicals, African American activists as terrorists, and that would be obviously a horrible precedent. I think, this is a personal political opinion, I think a compromise has to be found here. There should be a way to prosecute these kinds of crimes as terrorist crimes. I know our governor in New York, Andrew Cuomo, has promoted legislation to that effect. We're all pretty smart people. There's got to be a way to do it, and I don't think we should continue to have that gap in the law. James Fields, who drove the car and killed Heather, and that, as Seth described, was prosecuted just really for murder. There was no greater statute that they could use to charge him with.
I also think there's some even more basic things that still need to be done, because in addition to, again, the stats I talked about earlier with DOJ and Department of Homeland Security, there's a bill, for example, that Dick Durbin, the senator, sponsors that would just require basic levels of communication and cooperation between federal agencies on issues like this that isn't happening currently. And so we're really starting with a very low bar on how to move this issue forward on the government and law enforcement level. I think, again, as I said, there are people in these law enforcement agencies who are immensely talented and aware of this threat, but making sure that we're giving them the tools to effectively deal with it continues to be a struggle. And so even something like this bill, this Durbin bill that I mentioned, would ensure levels of communication and cooperation that seemingly don't even exist. So there's a lot to be done here, and I think a long way to go.
Have either of you seen repentance in the wake of Charlottesville? People who were involved in the hate marches who repented?
You want to address the issue? Go ahead, Amy. We're both laughing because it's kind of come up recently. Go ahead, Amy.
I'm looking at Mike in the audience. There's one defendant who very recently, the same defendant whose phone has miraculously and mysteriously fallen into the toilet before we needed to collect evidence off of it, who is on a bit of a redemption tour right now. And whether, if he's actually redeeming himself, by all means, I'm glad, but I think we're rightfully skeptical. And at the end of the day, we think that the best way to repent would be to cooperate with the discovery process in our case. Look, I think, going back to some of the points we talked about before, there are a lot of the defendants, or at least some of the defendants, have talked about how they're not going to participate in certain things because they're afraid of being sued again. They're not going to go back to Charlottesville in 2018 because they're afraid of being sued again. Richard Spencer was not going to go back to business as usual because he was afraid of being sued again. But I don't see that as repentance. I see that as common sense.
So that's very different.
Exactly.
That's
so, I frankly have not seen a lot of repentance. I can't imagine others have as well. I think the case provides a really useful opportunity for some of these folks to repent, and Purim is coming up.
Seth, you're representing the faith community, and as you point out, the coalition you tried to bring together was diverse. Have you seen any evidence of that, and have anyone in the faith community, as far as you know, tried to reach out to change the hearts and minds and souls of these individuals? Is that a fool's errand, given how hardened things, or do you think that is core to your mission as a part of the faith-based community?
That's a great question. So there were certainly those, I mentioned the kind of litany of excuses we got from a variety of faith leaders who didn't want to show up and quote unquote confront the white supremacists. And one of those excuses was, well, aren't we supposed to love our enemies? And yes, I preach that as well. But it also gets at, very practically, what are we doing with our 24/7, 365? And on this day, August 12th, 2017, violent white supremacy is coming to do violence and murder. Where will we locate ourselves? And our posture and perspective was, we show God's love is for all by standing with those they come to do violence against. I think it centers whiteness and white supremacy to say, well, let's just love on them and everything. Oh, you want Jason Kessler's email? Here you go. You got 364 other days, but no one's done that. And as for the Nazis themselves, some repentance means to turn around, to turn towards a life-giving way and walk in that. We bear fruits worthy of repentance. And so I think it'd be wonderful for more people to show up in the fight against these violent ideologies, because it shows that the fabric of humanity isn't rooted in a lie. And this case is one of many ways to do that. But if push comes to shove, and this is out of my faith calling, I'm going to spend my 16 waking hours a day with those who are already marginalized and oppressed by systems and individuals, and hope that the light and love of God permeates through that. I can understand why people might double down on a violent lie that permeates our entire country. But yeah.
I guess that's what's striking, is that instead of this being a shock of recognition that caused some people to wake up, that this wasn't just politics, identity politics, it wasn't just ideology, this was violence, this was hate, there does seem to be a doubling down. And that creates certain storm clouds. One of the questions in here is, do you all expect this to get worse as we head into the 2020 election? You're playing a long game in the court. But these forces still seem fairly at play in our nation, even though some of the actors have been restrained in the wake of this suit. Do you expect it to get worse, or what, if anything, gives you hope as we face 2020?
I do think the trial will be a moment where
And when do you expect it to come to trial?
mid to late 2020. I think it's very possible this trial could happen right in the midst of the presidential. And to be clear, this is going to be a multi-week jury trial in Charlottesville, blocks away from Heather Heyer Way, where we quite literally put the leaders of the white nationalist movement on the stand and hold them accountable for what they did. And that will be a stunning moment. And it will force, as Robbie talked about earlier, a public reckoning in this country. This case might not be getting a ton of media attention right now. It's gotten some, and we're very grateful for it. But when that trial is happening, it will be getting the level of coverage that we think this issue deserves, because it will be the leaders of this movement being held accountable. And I think that will help force a reckoning in a way that hasn't quite happened yet. And on a more practical level, as we win these sanctions motions like the one we won the other week, and certainly as we win these massive judgments in the case, it has the potential to really both have that bankrupting and dismantling effect on the defendants and the groups that I talked about, but hopefully have a chilling effect on the broader movement as well, in that it'll show if you do something like this, if you are part of a conspiracy like this, we will take you on, we will take you to court, and we will bankrupt you. And that has real potential. I think, I don't think we're gonna beat this with a carrot. You need to use the stick of our courts. And we're using our justice system instead of tiki torches and guns, like Robbie said, and that's very important. But that is one of the key ways we're going to actually beat them.
And to be clear, and I probably are watching this, if any of the defendants are watching this and they want to truly repent and to come forward and tell the truth of what they did and what happened, we are, I'll take that call in 2 seconds. We are open ears and would welcome that, but it's got to be true repentance. They have to tell us what they did and who they spoke with and what happened. And we will take them in and we will listen to them, and we will settle with the defendant who would take that position for sure.
Well, on that note, I think that is the right note to end on. Thank you all very, very much.